Who are the most iconic villains in film and literature? Professor Moriarty? Hannibal Lecter? Child's Play. They're not responsible for that much death. What about Dracula? What about the Joker? Now we're getting a little more dangerous because they actually affected entire regions of people. How about Sauron or Darth Vader? Now we're getting serious. They marched armies and destroyed worlds. Vader even went full space Nazi and helped rule over an entire galaxy. King of all villains, though, would have to be Thanos, who wanted to kill half of all life in the universe, people chosen at random, as he said, dispassionate, rich and poor alike, in a Malthusian effort to bring the universe into balance. Who could possibly compete with such destruction of life? I can think of only one. What's funny about one villain that could be worse than Thanos is that he wasn't written as a villain, and he is worshipped by billions of people around the world, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims. He is Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, the God of Abraham, who shares the same origin story across all three religions, from Moses to Jesus and eventually to Muhammad. Isn't it ridiculous to call a beloved character a villain, though? No, not really. Several of the villains I already mentioned are well-liked, too. Hannibal Lecter's calculating psychopathy is eventually used against other antagonists in cathartic ways. The Joker is funny and interesting, stands by his principles, and often makes insightful criticisms of society. Thanos, though ruthless, has integrity. He lives by the standard he sets for others. Thanos is not simply motivated by hate, and he shows respect and admiration for the people who resist him. Even a disliked villain's brutality can be seen as a redeeming quality, as when the Faith Militant took over King's Landing and people wished cruel Joffrey was still king instead of mild-mannered Tommen. Anti-heroes like Riddick and Blade, feared as monsters, come from the places they eventually fight against, and oftentimes they're preferred over explicitly good characters like Superman, who are perhaps less relatable. Even in real life, famous serial killers and mass murderers develop cult followings, infatuated people, some even wanting to marry those killers. The greatest villains aren't the ones who are mindlessly over-the-top evil with motivations so outlandish that regular people cannot relate to them. When you can empathize with the villain, when you can understand their motivations, and even when you sort of like them, they have the power to transcend the mundane and become iconic. What makes God so powerful as a villain is not his omnipotence, which is ironically his greatest weakness, but rather that he literally is us. We project our egos onto God. People entangle their identities with this character, and since nobody sees themselves as the villain, they don't see God as the villain either. The believer doesn't typically envision being the recipient of God's wrath, as that's reserved for their enemies, who just so happen to also always be God's enemies. Not a coincidence. Yahweh is the one-size-fits-all supervillain. He's like water. He'll take the shape of whatever container you put him in. In other words, his very nature will reflect the ego of the individual believer. Where an evangelical creationist might envision a wrathful God, a Unitarian Universalist might envision an inclusive, forgiving God. Both wildly incompatible interpretations can be based on the exact same source material. This simply cannot happen without dramatic personal bias. Of course, this explains why God isn't written as the villain in the Bible, because remember who wrote the Bible. Would Thanos' loyal followers write Thanos as the villain either? No. We must therefore pay close attention to a character's words and actions to understand their true implications, even if the authors are attempting to paint that character in a positive light. The people who invented God wrote him to be the good guy who would destroy their enemies or even justify their own atrocities, which is why a supposedly spaceless and timeless being was so wrapped up in a culture of a particular place at a particular time. It is not until you get to know God's supposed enemies that you realize God is actually the villain in the story. To get to know those enemies, you may have to get to know people who believe differently than you. Or you may even have to look in the mirror, even if you consider yourself a true believer. Why is Yahweh a villain, let alone the worst villain? It can certainly be compelling to point out atrocities in the Bible committed or commanded by God. One problem with that approach is when apologists can't come up with a satisfactory excuse, they appeal to our ignorance as limited human beings, so no matter what, they always have a trump card. If I point out how God killed all the firstborn in Egypt, or demanded the deaths of Midianite babies, or even flooded the entire earth, killing children and animals alike, it won't really matter to some people. In these stories, the blameless consistently pay the ultimate price for the guilty, which is not only a theme we repeatedly see in the Bible, but is also a hallmark of terrorism. These actions are typically found within the realm of supervillains, yet they are seen as acceptable for someone who was not written as a villain. How could this be? I could point out hundreds more examples of clearly villainous behavior committed or commanded by the Abrahamic God, and that is useful because it does help mitigate the misconceptions many people have, but there will always be others who either find justifications or appeal to our ignorance. They presuppose that this God character is perfectly good, so no matter what terrible event we offer as evidence, he absolutely had to have morally sufficient reasons, and we are simply not in a good position at this juncture to know what those reasons were. An omniscient God beyond space and time who sees the end result at the beginning of time might have a good reason to allow or inflict what may seem like needless suffering, say the apologists, only to facilitate a greater good in another place and or at another time, a butterfly effect. Only then will it be clear to us. The colloquial version of this response is God works in mysterious ways. This is where my real argument comes into play, because it's when they invoke God's greatest powers that they open up their doctrine's greatest vulnerabilities. While the history of this debate is utterly clogged with arguments about whether something God specifically did or said was immoral, so as to point out a contradiction in his alleged nature, in the end, none of that is truly necessary. We actually don't even need to know God's individual reasons for his individual actions or even inactions in the face of evil and suffering. A sanctuary for the religious in this debate, free will, does not even need to be considered. All we truly need to do is ask one simple Machiavellian question: does the end justify the means? When the apologists say that we are not in a good position as limited human beings to fully know God's morally sufficient reasons, they're actually saying something that isn't true given their doctrine, which plainly describes the end game in detail. Their apologetics are always designed to explain away past actions, but they never account for what is written in the Bible about the future. So whatever God's reasons for allowing or inflicting suffering at any given instance, they're reasons in service to his end goal, a goal for which we are not ignorant. One argument is that the end could never justify the means because we are more closely defined by our journey than by our destination. But for the purposes of this argument, we are going to give the religious every benefit of the doubt and say that a positive end could justify negative means. So what is necessary to show a positive or negative outcome? What does the Bible have to tell us about the end goal? Before we answer that, first consider the trolley problem, a famous thought experiment in ethics that places you near a switch while a runaway trolley heads toward 5 people tied to a track. If you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track where there is only 1 person tied up. So, the only way to save the 5 people would be to pull the lever and kill the 1. If you do nothing, 5 people will die. According to a survey published in Time magazine, 90% of people say they would pull the lever and sacrifice the 1 to save the 5. Some argue that it is moral to do nothing, thus you would not be actively participating in taking anyone's life. What everyone can agree upon, however, is that it would be immoral if the trolley were heading for 1 person and you pulled the lever so that it would be diverted to kill 5 people. That is what a villain would do. Even if the 1 person is someone you love and the other 5 are strangers, I think we could all agree that pulling the lever would be understandable, but still immoral. Perhaps our love would override our morality. In that case, that's one way to become the reluctant villain with relatable motivation. When I ask you how sacrificing 1 person to save 5 relates to the God of the Bible, most people would probably immediately think of Jesus' story of sacrifice. We do need to consider Jesus, but not in the way you think. If we look to Jesus Christ to determine how God answers the trolley problem, we must look to Luke chapter 13, verses 22 through 24. Then Jesus traveled throughout the towns and villages, teaching as he made his way toward Jerusalem. "Lord," someone asked him, "will only a few people be saved?" Jesus answered, "Make every effort to enter through the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able." This gives us part of the answer, but it's not quite sufficient, so we must also look at how this is further elucidated in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." This makes it clear beyond the shadow of any doubt that the end does not justify the means. Where Thanos wipes out half of everyone, God wipes out the vast majority. Thanos, an obvious supervillain, is actually far less destructive than the God of the Bible. Not only did God tie everyone to the track, but he's pulling the lever to kill 5 people in order to save 1. He's taking the action that everyone can agree is immoral. Not only does this immoral choice taint God, but it also taints the believers, because the majority of people will not be saved, and God knows that before those people even existed. Then the purpose for their existence, knowingly doomed, must be to facilitate the people who will be saved. So, if Christianity were true, as a non-Christian, my purpose and the purpose of billions of other people is to be sacrificed so that Christians can get into heaven. Unlike Jesus, we don't come back to life. Our sacrifice would be permanent. It is immoral to accept that the majority must be sacrificed just to save your own skin. It would be as if you knew Thanos' plan to wipe out half of all life, but he offered to spare you if you swore allegiance to him. Now, imagine that you've never even seen Thanos, and an anonymous person merely told you all that stuff in the Marvel movies was true. Would you still swear allegiance to Thanos and accept him and his plan to commit mass genocide just to save your own skin? If so, you probably aren't a very moral person. The apologists would no doubt say that it is not God's choice to do that, it's our choice. After all, aren't we making the decision of our own free will to reject God? Don't we have the power to change which track we're on? No. First and foremost, free will isn't even actually a rebuttal to this particular argument. If God is omniscient, if God is beyond time, then he sees the end at the beginning, and it's God's choice to create a universe that leads to a particular outcome. That would not affect our free will. If God wanted a world in which most people are saved, he could have created a world more conducive to saving most people, perhaps with more convincing evidence to compel more people to properly believe. In other words, instead of creating a narrow path to life and a wide path to destruction, he could have done the inverse. In a burning building, is it the hero or the villain who makes it more difficult for people to get through the doors? He could have even created a world in which belief was not a requisite. The choice to make that rule was his, not ours. Another reason free will cannot be an answer is that belief is not even a choice. People often say, I choose to believe this or that, but that's impossible. That may sound unusual to some of you, but it's actually easy to demonstrate. For instance, choose to believe right now that you can fly like Superman. Can you do that? No, of course not. You cannot simply choose to sincerely believe that you have superpowers. To believe, you must be convinced. What if I told you that if you do not believe that you can fly like Superman right now, I'm going to punish you? Does that sound fair? After all, it must be nice to fly like Superman, and being punished doesn't sound like fun, so why not just simply choose to believe it? Sounds ridiculous when I apply the religious standard to other beliefs, doesn't it? You can't choose to believe you're Superman, no matter the carrot nor the stick. Likewise, I cannot simply choose to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, no matter how much I am threatened or promised reward. The only choice I truly have in affecting my beliefs is to investigate the claims, and I have done so far more than most. Others have done the same, however, and they've come away as believers. Why the difference? Because we are different. God, of all people, would know what convinces each and every one of us, and if he truly cared about us, he would have created the world in such a way that we would be convinced to believe what is true while maintaining our free will to make an informed choice about whether to accept or reject his offer of salvation. Human beings have wildly different capabilities. Some of us can run marathons, while others can barely walk. Some of us can do complex equations in our head, while others can't do basic math with pencil and paper. Who would hold us all to the same standard? A loving good guy who wants each and every one of us to know him? Or a supervillain looking to cull the herd? The only person truly making an informed choice is God, when He made the world with insufficient evidence to convince the vast majority of humanity to believe properly. And this belief rule is also contingent upon a decision made by God to make such a belief a requisite of salvation. Remember, He could have done it in any way He wanted, but chose to do it in a way that results in a loss of most of humanity. So this idea that most people will be discarded in God's grand creation is based upon multiple choices made by God Himself and zero choices made by the people. In the end, thankfully, the world's worst supervillain is fictional. Human beings have always been skilled at coming up with creative ways to hurt and control others. And convincing people to worry about this supervillain has been a tried and true way to scare people into submission or rile them to hate others. Considerations of this particular supervillain permeate and affect our lives, from the bedroom all the way up to the Oval Office. For the sake of our children's future, I believe we should do what we can to diminish the people's ability to maliciously use that fictional character as an authoritarian tool. Thank you for listening. While I have not drawn anything in years, those of you who have been subscribers for a long time know that on the rare occasions I do drawings like these, I put them on eBay for anyone to bid upon. As usual, I'm starting them at $1 each, and they will remain on auction for 1 week, starting when this video is uploaded. I greatly appreciate your bids as they help me out and subsequently the Dark Matter 2525 channel. I'm especially appreciative of the patrons and Subscribestar contributors who make these videos possible during this era of demonetization. Thank you so much for enabling me to do this, and I endeavor to remain worthy of your support.